This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. 1850 to approximately 1874, 1876. Those 25 years. Alan Taylor's new book, American Civil Wars, A Continental History. We're looking at a period of time when not just the United States, but also our neighbors in North America, Canada, the Dominion of Canada, and Mexico, the Republic of Mexico, were not only watching each other, but also engaged in conflict, constant conflict and violence, extreme violence, rampages, homicides, all of that inside the ambition for a better government. I welcome Professor Taylor to speak of these matters. He's written a comprehensive story, and we can only touch on some of the anecdotes. The professor is the Thomas Jefferson Foundation Professor of History at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, Virginia, founded by Thomas Jefferson. So I've been noting to the professor how come famous people are always available at the scenes that are famous in history. Economy of the scene. Well, there were professors at Thomas Jefferson's University. Professor Allen, a very good evening to you. I begin with your storytelling of a young woman born in 1807, Jane Maria Eliza McManus. She is one part of the transformation that America is going to go through in the middle of the century. What do we need to know about her upbringing and her preparation for her editorial boldness? Good evening to you.
Good evening to you, and thank you for having me on, John. Well, Jane McManus grew up in a wealthy family in upstate New York, and she received the top-of-the-line education available for a young woman. She went to Emma Willard School. There were no colleges or universities open to women at that time. And she moved to New York City. She married her father's law partner. That broke up. And she moved to New York City, and she became involved, at least in business terms, with Aaron Burr. And Aaron Burr was involved in land speculation in Texas, and this opened doors for her. And she became a very ambitious woman, and her ambitions were tied to expanding the United States.
Expanding the United States with race consciousness. I believe at some point she talked about whitening America and that the climates of the Caribbean were more useful for slavery. So at some point, she was influenced by the slavocracy, although she didn't grow up in it. Does that evidence that there were anti-abolitionists all through the North?
Of course. Abolitionists were a small minority in the North during the 1830s, 1840s, and even 1850s. A lot of Northerners were anti-slavery without being abolitionists. Well, what does that mean? It means they didn't want slavery to expand. But there were also many Northerners. The dominant party was the Democratic Party. And at that time, the Democratic Party, very different from today's Democratic Party. The Democrats of the 1830s, 40s, and 50s were, we had to be blunt, very racist. And they'd play the race card to win elections. And McManus, who then later married and became Casno, she's probably the author of the very famous essay that coined the phrase manifest destiny. And she's among many thinkers associated with the Democratic Party in the North who said, don't be afraid of expanding slavery further south into around the Caribbean, into Mexico and Cuba and so forth. Because if you do that, African people of African descent will naturally be shifted there, and you'll end up whitening the states of, say, Virginia and Kentucky. And so this was it seems very perverse to us today to read people writing this. And she's not alone in this. There were many people who would write this, said actually the way to whiten America, which they saw as a good thing, is to expand slave society of the United States further south.
In addition, she marries a man named William Casino. So Jane is not only thinking of race, she's thinking of the Caribbean, the Central America, acquiring property,
Yeah,
large tracts of property, and I believe they moved to Santo Domingo, and
right.
they get caught up in the imperialism that the young American Republic practiced. What does what does Jane imagine happening in the Caribbean for the U.S.?
Well, she would like the United States to acquire Nicaragua, Cuba, big chunks of Mexico, and what was called Santo Domingo, what is today the Dominican Republic. And she acquired lands in many of these places. And she saw this as a way to make money. She was very ambitious. And she also saw it as a way to expand the power of the United States and to fend off Britain. So there was this exaggerated fear of the British Empire as trying to hem in the United States and halt what she called the manifest destiny of the United States to expand not just west to the Pacific, but south around the Caribbean.
We go to not the opposite, but certainly a woman much in the same mold, well educated and ambitious. A Pittsburgh family. Her unmarried name was Jane Grey Cannon. She married a young farmer named Swisshelm, and so we know her as Swisshelm. What do we need to know about her background, Professor?
Well, there are ways in which she's similar in that she has a very powerful will, a powerful intellect, and like Casno, will go into journalism. Both of them had an unhappy marriage to start with, but Swisshelm will not ever remarry. And she develops views that are very different from Casno's, where Casno wants to expand America's slave society southward. Swisshelm becomes a very strong and early abolitionist and a committed feminist. So she will become one of the most fiery journalists in the United States. And she will be committed to a very different vision of what the American future should be, very different from what Casno was promoting.
She moves to Minnesota, St. Cloud, Minnesota, where she becomes a bane of the local mayor, who's a
Yeah,
Democrat,
yeah,
and founds a newspaper. This was the best technology of the time. I think it would be the same as putting Wi-Fi into a village that never had it before. And her position in Minnesota, is it embraced by other people around her, by the farmers around her?
Well, she's a very popular journalist, but like any place, politics are divided. And the mayor of St. Cloud and the political boss was a transplanted Southerner who did not like what Swisshelm was publishing, which were very, let's say, vicious attacks on him and on slavery. So we think of Minnesota, because it's very far to the north, as a place that surely must have been very early committed to anti-slavery. And in general, the people were opposed to slavery being expanded in their midst, but there were politicians among them who, in fact, were promoting protecting slavery in the South. And Swisshelm is at odds with Lowry, who is the
Yeah,
mayor.
she's very good about mocking him. Yes,
Mhm.
every Southern gentleman has the right to whip women and rob mothers of their children.
Mhm.
However, there is an irony here that you confront,
Mhm.
and that is that Swisshelm is brutally, brutally prejudiced towards Native Americans, brutally
Yeah,
prejudiced.
yeah,
What
yeah.
explains what explains that it's like holding two ideas in your mind at the same time?
Yeah. Well, we that's applying our expectations of our time onto people of the 19th century. In the 19th century, she certainly appears to be a great crusader for racial equality in terms of her acceptance of the equality of African Americans, which made her very radical. But she's also very prone to other prejudices that were widespread in the United States and a hatred and denigration of Native peoples was almost universal. And she's in Minnesota. And what unhinges her on the Native issue. She was never particularly sound. She saw them as lazy beggars and thought that the expansion of American society into the Native world was improving that world by bringing in more agriculture and more private property. But when the Dakota Indians of Minnesota rose up in rebellion and killed a fair number of people, including some women, that unhinges Swisshelm, who had this great empathy for other women, but she did not extend it to Native American women. And so it makes very difficult reading to hear her referring to Native peoples as hyenas who must be exterminated. But this wasn't a one-off for her. She did a speaking tour throughout other northern states at the peak of the American Civil War to say that the Union needed to also focus on exterminating Native peoples in the West. And so she's a great introduction to the complexity of racial thinking in 19th century America, which is not consistent in the ways that we might expect it to be consistent.
The book is American Civil Wars, A Continental History, 1850 to 1873. Professor Alan Taylor is the author. Harriet Tubman, she escapes slavery and travels to Canada, but then risks her life again and again coming back. What did she see that she could achieve? We call it the Underground Railroad. How did it work, Professor?
Well, the primary conductors of this railroad, and the railroad is not institutionalized, it's very informal, but there were networks of people, mostly free African Americans living in northern states, but also a significant number of sympathetic white Northerners, especially Quakers. And they would hide out enslaved people who were running away from slavery in Maryland, in Tubman's case, Virginia, Kentucky. So it's important to bear in mind that while northern states had freed themselves of slavery in their midst, they remained within the United States. And under the law of the United States, under the law of the U.S. Constitution, the original Constitution, there was a fugitive slave clause that bound all states within the Union to return what was called runaway property. So if you escaped from slavery in Maryland and you made your way to Pennsylvania, you were not fully free because there was always the danger that some constable or some posse or slave catchers would come and grab you and take you before a magistrate, and it would be ruled that you were a former property back in the state of Maryland and take you back there. So for any kind of security in this new freedom of the runaway would have to make it all the way to Canada. And that's what Harriet Tubman did. But she still had friends and family back in Maryland. And so she did her best to slip back into Maryland and to arrange the escapes. And she knew the sympathetic people along the way to Canada in Pennsylvania and Ohio and Western New York State, where they could hide out so that the legal authorities could not find the refugees seeking freedom.
There are contrasts at this time between African Americans who were slaves or are freed and those who have escaped slavery. And the professor offers a contrast between two styles. Martin Delany, who is a very well-educated man and was never a slave, and Frederick Douglass, a very well-educated man who was a slave and escaped slavery. If I understand correctly, Professor, Frederick Douglass is for a moderate road of using law and the vote in order to win freedom for Africans that are now slaves. But Martin Delany is something closer to a nationalist. Did they argue about it together?
Well, they did, but Frederick Douglass was perfectly willing to see violence used. I mean, he's a great supporter of the Union's war against the Confederacy. He just is pushing Lincoln and other Republican leaders of the United States at that time to make the Civil War a crusade against slavery. It was not such a crusade at the start. So, and Douglas had a long flirtation with John Brown, who was very radical and violent abolitionist. So Douglas is not closing the door on violence against slavery. Delany, however, is a greater enthusiast for it. And Delany is a Black nationalist. Delany has come to believe that you could not expect any sincere and consistent help from white Americans, with the exception of John Brown, and therefore that American Blacks had to act for themselves, and they had to be prepared to kill their masters in order to become free. Douglas is much more committed to an integrationist view of American society, in which Blacks would be the equals of white Americans, but they would be able to coexist. Whereas Delany believed that African Americans would have to leave the United States and found their own country in Africa.
At this time, a novel is published and sells, I think, 3 million copies eventually. Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher. The plot is Harriet Beecher herself. She marries Calvin Stowe, and she's at Bowdoin College. And Professor, I recently came across the fact that the students would gather around her salon and listen to her and Calvin talk. And one of the students was Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, the leader of the 20th Maine. So Harriet Beecher, her novel was exactly at the right place at the right time. All these young men who would go on to fight the war remembered her for it. Is she celebrated today for that? Not just the novel, but the fact that she was inspirational. We have 30 seconds.
Yeah, she's celebrated for that. Now, her novel is a tough read today because it's very melodramatic and sentimental, but that was the style of the times, and that's why it became so popular. And so she is one of the great creators of empathy among white Americans for the experience of enslaved African Americans.
Yes, Harriet Beecher, who was married to Calvin Stowe. Calvin Stowe is the professor at Bowdoin College, and Harriet Beecher's there with students gathered in the room. They enjoy telling stories to each other. That's the scene you think of. That's 1852, 1853. Now the villains. Alan Taylor's the author. American Civil Wars is the book. A Continental History. The three republics, well, two republics and one dominion, watching each other at this time, and watching especially the outspoken and aggressive voices of men from the South. There was an opinion at the time that the South dominated the U.S. Congress. It was called the slavocracy, and it was organized and aggressive with some very, very well-spoken politicians. We need to meet some of them to understand the rhetoric of the period. Professor John C. Calhoun, I always think of him coming into the room and you can smell sulfur. Who was he? What do we need to know about him?
Well, you could also smell intellect. He's one of the smartest men to ever be in the U.S. Senate. And he had started out his career as a great nationalist in the 18 teens. But as the South began to lag behind the northern states in population and economic development, that meant lagging behind in political power in the House of Representatives. And Calhoun then became very concerned about a future in which the northern states would be dominant and they might interfere in Southern society, and in particular with the defining institution of Southern society, which was chattel slavery. So Calhoun devoted his later career not to boosting the United States, but by trying to limit the power of the federal government to do anything within the states. He became a great champion of states' rights. Now, he's a complex man in that he was not on board with many other Southerners who were trying to expand slave society into Texas, Mexico, Cuba, Santo Domingo, in that he saw that as expanding the power of the federal government, and he thought the power of the federal government would eventually be applied to the southern states if precedents were set for an active federal government.
This is the period of time when the Whigs and the Democrats are watching their ranks broken by the arrival of new parties, the Free Soil Party,
Mhm.
the Know Nothing Party, and then eventually the Republican Party, 1854 to 1856. The Republican Party was driven by concerns about the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and that means we have to go to Stephen Douglas of Illinois. Stephen Douglas famously courted the young woman who would become Mary Lincoln. But it's most important to mention that he married very well in 1847, an heiress and owned slaves. What do we need to know about Douglas? He seems to be astride two worlds.
Well, Douglas grew up in New England, and so he's not a Southerner, but he moved to Illinois. And Illinois is it's one of the swing states of that time. Southern Illinois had many settlers who had moved over from southern states. Northern part of the state, mostly people who had come in from New England or other northern states. And Douglas is the dominant Democratic politician in the northern states. He's extremely eloquent, gregarious, powerful memory, very few scruples. And he is very successful in Illinois politics. He becomes senator from Illinois, and he wants to become president. And to become president within the Democratic Party meant that he would need support in the South. So he's always casting about for some formula for allowing Southern expansion of its slave society into the West, but in a way that won't be alarming to the northern states. Well, that's a tough thing to pull off. But he designs the so-called Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. And the goal of that act is to say, we're not going to have the Congress intervene in the question in a particular territory, such as Kansas or Nebraska. We're going to leave it up to the local settlers. They'll decide for themselves. And that seems to just open up this wedge for expansion. It's acceptable to many Northerners. It's acceptable to most Southerners. And Douglas then thinks that he's accomplished a great political miracle and it's going to boost him into the presidency. But instead, it kicks the hornet's nest because it invites people in with their rifles to try to settle the issue in Kansas through violence. And it's very discrediting then to Stephen A. Douglas and his hopes of suppressing the slavery issue in politics. Instead, he's made it much, much worse.
Working with Douglas to get that law and act passed was a member of the House of Representatives at the time, Alexander Stephens, whom I always wrote down as Vice President Confederacy and didn't look farther than that. What a character, Alan. 100 pounds and pale, looking like a corpse, a Whig until he became a Democrat, surviving a knife attack. I'm following Alan's reporting, in which he was stabbed so many times he lost the use of his right arm. What do we need to know about Alexander Stephens's vision of the future?
Well, Stephens had been a member of the Whig Party. So during the 1830s, 1840s, the two-party system were the Democrats and the Whigs. And the Whigs were in favor of a more active federal government. That didn't mean that the Whig Party was anti-slavery. There were some anti-slavery men from the North, some, and they would be in the Whig Party. Alexander Stephens was never exactly anti-slavery, although he understood that it was a system of exploitation. But initially he's opposed to the expansion of slave society elsewhere in the continent. But after this knife attack, he reconsiders and he becomes very committed to the expansion of slavery, and he switches from the Whigs to become a Democrat. Now, part of the tragedy, I would say, of Alexander Stephens is he's a man who's trapped in this emaciated, disease-weakened body, and he has one of the most powerful minds. He's somebody capable of great friendship, very gregarious. And one of his best friends in Congress in the middle of the 1840s was Abraham Lincoln. So their paths would later cross through correspondence and then in one meeting during the Civil War, in which Lincoln would try to draw upon that friendship to try to get Stevens to be a broker for reconciling an alienated South to the rest of the Union. But it doesn't work.
There are moments in the 1850s that strike you as forever opera. The burning of Lawrence or the caning of Sumner. I want to go to one in particular, 1855 at Osawatomie. With broadswords, John Brown, a man from New England, my memory.
Well, he's from upstate New York.
That's upstate New York. A man.
Yeah, but a lot of New Englanders had settled there, so it's from greater New England. Yeah.
Using broadswords with some of his sons, two of his sons, hacked to death men whom they regarded as slave keepers. Now, at that time, Brown was seen as a crusader or a murderer. How was he initially understood after that incident?
Well, it depends on what circle you were in. If you were among Southerners, including people from Missouri, who were promoting the expansion of slavery, then there's no question that John Brown and his sons were brutal murderers. Now, if you were radical abolitionists who had reached the conviction that Congress would never do anything to abolish slavery and that only violent action could do so, then you would think of John Brown as an Old Testament prophet come back to earth, enacting the divine will to end the great national sin of slavery. So it would depend on your perspective.
What I'm reading, Professor, going through your explications, is that there was fluidity in opinion about slaves and about states' rights, and they're washing back and forth in the national argument. The 52 election of Franklin Pierce, the 56 election of Buchanan, the 54 to 56 creation of the Republican Party with John Fremont, their first candidate. Lincoln's name mentioned at the Philadelphia Convention in 1856. All of that meant that there were men who were attempting to find a middle ground, a moderate course, and they were elbowed out. They changed sides. How do you see what happened to moderation in the 1850s?
Well, it's important to avoid thinking of the North as united behind either anti-slavery or abolition, whereas the South was much more unified in its commitment to slavery. Now, of course, African Americans couldn't vote, and they were considered, almost all of them were considered property and held in harsh conditions. So, but in the North, there was a very powerful commitment to the concept of the Union. The notion that the union of the states, as different as they were, was essential to keeping the peace in North America, that if there was disunion, everyone understood, there would be a very bloody civil war. And the fear was that if there was a bloody civil war, that it would bring to the fore, on all sides, military dictators, and it would destroy free government in North America. And there was a widespread conviction that if free government was destroyed in North America, that it would never revive anywhere else in the world. So if you're committed to that notion, that is your priority for most Northerners, is how do we preserve the Union? A lot of them were opposed to the expansion of slavery, but they're quite clear, the Northern majority, that they don't want to interfere in slavery in the South because to do so would be to break up the Union. Lincoln was of that persuasion during the 1850s. So Lincoln favored a compromise that would reassure the South, we will leave slavery alone where it now exists. But he wanted to stop slave society from expanding anywhere else. That was unacceptable to the South. And Stephen A. Douglas is trying to come up with a formula that would allow some Southern expansion into the West. And so we have many different politicians who are trying different angles to try to keep the issue of slavery from blowing up the United States. That's their priority. Their priority is not to end slavery. Their priority was to preserve the Union. But some politicians thought you could preserve the Union while containing slavery. That's Lincoln's position. While others believed that you could only preserve the Union if you allowed slavery to have some expansion. And that was Douglas's position.
Was there a moment, Alan, when either side or both sides came to see that they were irreconcilable?
Well, I would say there's no clear moment for most Americans until April of 1861, when the new Confederacy opens fire on a federal fort in Charleston Harbor named Fort Sumter. Until that point, I would say a majority of Northerners still hoped that there was some political formula that could reconcile the Southern states into returning to the Union so that there would be no Civil War. But the attack on Fort Sumter shatters that illusion throughout the United States.
And the war begins, and the worst case scenario is what follows. We're going to turn to the other part of North America that we've not dealt with so far, the liberalism of Mexico. Alan Taylor is the author of the new book, American Civil Wars, A Continental History, 1850 to 1873. We've looked at North America from the point of view of the United States being torn apart by what was called sectionalism at the time, also the politics of the parties. But then again, slavery and states' rights were the crowning issues. We go to Mexico and a man named Melchor Ocampo. Who was he, Professor?
Well, Melchor Ocampo was raised in a very wealthy family. He was adopted, but he was raised in a very wealthy, prestigious family. And Mexico of the first half of the 19th century was an extremely unequal society in which there was a relatively small class proud of their white skins and their Spanish heritage who dominated society, wherein most of the people living in Mexico were people of native descent. They were called Indians, or those who were mixed in race were the mestizos. And they were the vast majority of Mexicans, and the great majority of them lived in poverty. So it's a tough society to try to run a republic, a government where people elect their leaders, and that a majority of Mexicans lacked power, lacked property, and lacked education. So, but Ocampo comes to see this unequal society and say this is a great wrong, and things must be done to expand education, to expand educational opportunities and economic opportunities, so that Mexico could become a more equal society, one that could sustain a more stable republic. So Ocampo applies his elite education for a vision that is quite utopian, associated with the Liberal Party of Mexico, which had the conviction that if you equalized the rights of people and you weakened the power of traditional institutions in Mexico, and those traditional institutions were the Catholic Church, the army, and the wealthy landlords. So Ocampo is turning against the class that he'd grown up in. And so he's hated by that class. And the political party of that class of people were the conservatives. The conservatives were not so committed to a republic. They're open to converting Mexico to some sort of empire or monarchy. They are very clear that they want to preserve inequality from a conviction that that inequality sustains social stability. So Ocampo is the great enemy in the eyes of the conservatives of Mexico, who had been the dominant party for most of the early 19th century, since Mexico had become independent circa 1821. Go ahead.
And what begins is a brutal civil war between these factions. I had no idea about the the execution of prisoners.
Yeah. So the liberals and the conservatives hated each other. So when the liberals gained power and wrote a new constitution in which the ideas of Ocampo were very prominent, the conservatives started to stage a massive revolt. And there were many poor Mexicans who actually supported the conservatives because they were under the influence of the Catholic Church. And not all, but many Catholic priests persuaded the peasant parishioners that the liberals were godless atheists. So the conservatives are out to destroy the liberals, and the liberals are out to destroy the conservatives. And neither side had the capacity to keep prisoners. So if you were captured by the other side, you would almost certainly be executed.
We have a minute, Professor. The McLane-Ocampo Treaty, which is rejected by the Senate, what would that have rendered? What would it have delivered for both countries?
Well, this treaty was proposed. Ocampo was the Mexican foreign minister. There's a liberal government, but it's a beleaguered liberal government. The conservatives had actually seized control of Mexico City, and the liberals were operating out of Veracruz.
We have 30 seconds.
Okay, so the liberals needed money. They needed money desperately for their army. And so Ocampo strikes a deal with the United States that Mexico will lease very large chunks of Mexico to the United States to allow transit corridors that U.S. troops could patrol in return for a lot of money. But the U.S. Senate rejected this treaty.
Alan Taylor is the author. American Civil Wars is the book, A Continental History. The three states of North America, Mexico, the United States, and Canada. We've looked at the gathering storm in the United States, leading to the battles that were massacres from 1861 till 1865. We've looked at the revolution, so-called, which was really two sides butchering each other in Mexico over concepts of individual rights and freedom and liberty. Now we look at Canada because one person manages to tell the story with his life. Born 1815 in Glasgow, Scotland, John A. MacDonald. Professor, reading your presentation of MacDonald made me smile. Is that an appropriate response?
Well, he made people smile in his own time. He was a great storyteller, very gregarious, one of the epic drinkers in North American history, and a consummate politician of the old school, able to make deals with anybody. So there was this great anecdote which was told that an opposition member and John A. MacDonald were deep in their cups and hugging each other and drinking. And the opposition member said to John A. MacDonald, "How I love you, John A. How I wish I could trust you."
And his father was gregarious, as John A. was, but not especially successful. His mother was ambitious.
Yeah.
How striking it is that ambitious mothers lead to great statesmen. Very striking. I see this again and again.
Well, you see it with Lincoln. Lincoln was much closer to his mother than he was to his father.
And MacArthur, I was thinking of the Douglas MacArthur in the 20th century.
Yeah.
His mother moved to live outside of West Point while he was there. She was keen to maintain their relationship.
Yeah.
They moved to Kingston, Ontario, and he was ambitious enough. I don't think he went to college, but he became a lawyer when he was 20 years old. But he liked a good time.
He did like a good time.
You tell the story of a dead horse in a Methodist church. I didn't quite understand that one.
Well, like a lot of young, ambitious men with some intellect, he was attracted to ideas that challenged conventional Christian ideas. And so as a prank, they just hauled a dead horse into a Methodist church.
And he defended the young man.
Somebody else who was accused. And so he had some inside information because MacDonald had been involved in the whole thing. MacDonald was, he was a lawyer. as well as a politician. And that combination is very widespread in both the United States and Canada, but also in Mexico. So we look at the great leaders of all three of these polities, MacDonald, Lincoln, Benito Juarez, who we haven't covered quite yet, or Ocampo. They're all lawyers. So this is an age of opportunity if you are a lawyer. It's an age of expanding litigation and expanding legislation. And both of these are linked to the growing complexity of modern economies and modern transportation networks that generated new disputes.
Canada at this time doesn't look like the map we have now.
No.
The in-between part is indistinct. And the migrants are coming to the United States via Canada in some instances. As I remember reading one time, Alan, the passage was not as expensive going to Canada as it was to the US. I don't remember the details, but there was a period of time where it was economical to go to Canada and then sort of make your way south.
Well, during the 1820s and 1830s, the British government subsidized immigration to Canada. So if you're a poor person and you were in Ireland or you're in Scotland, your opportunity would be to ship out and go to Quebec. Now, for many of these people, ultimately, they want to go to the United States where the economy is booming. So that does happen. But once Britain lifted those subsidies, it's actually cheaper to go to New York City, and then immigration is much more via New York City than before.
John A. MacDonald also had the good luck to being a Scotsman.
Yep.
And that was a part of the Canadian migration that dominated. You mentioned the three great universities, McGill in Montreal, Dalhousie in Halifax, and the University of Toronto in Toronto, all founded by Scotsmen. And that gave him an advantage for politics, is that, or law, or both?
Well, all, the better educated people in Canada tended to be of Scots or Scots descent, and they supported each other. So if you were a merchant, or you were a newspaper publisher, or you were a lawyer, or you were founding a railroad, or you wanted to found a university, then you helped other Scots band together to do those things. So the governing class in Canada of that time, outside of Quebec, which was Francophone, but outside of Quebec, the dominant political element were Scots, and that helped John A. MacDonald get ahead.
He joins Parliament in 1844, and he has a talent. He can remember names, all names, and he also dresses very well. He's dapper.
Mm-hmm.
I love the story of how they chose Ottawa to be the capital. Tell that story, Professor.
Well, at the time, the capital, I should just back up and say that Canada, as you indicated, is much smaller. It wasn't really a country yet. It's still part of the British Empire. But two of the colonies of that British Empire, what is now Quebec and what is now Ontario, were united in a federation. Now, that federation had autonomy for domestic affairs, but is still overall governed by the British Empire and protected by the British Empire. But the colony of what is now Quebec, was then called Lower Canada, mostly Francophone, mostly Catholic. Upper Canada's mostly Protestant and mostly Scots descended. And the two parts don't work very well together. Though John A. MacDonald is the leading politician that is trying to promote cooperation and plays a major part in holding these two colonies together in this federation. But one of the great challenges, where the capital going to be? The leading cities were both in Quebec, Montreal and Quebec City. Toronto's kind of a third place, and Kingston's a fourth place. So the capital had bounced around between these four places from year to year. And MacDonald realizes you need one capital, and he's thinking somewhere right along the border between these two colonies. And the border was the Ottawa River, and there was a lumber town called Ottawa. But he knew that this would be unpopular with everybody. So he managed to engineer it that the decision would be turned over to Queen Victoria, the monarch of Britain, and she would decide. And then MacDonald and his other friends fed the information to the Queen, who'd never been to Canada, never would go to Canada, that Ottawa should be the selection. So she selected Ottawa, and there was a lot of grumbling. And for a brief while, MacDonald's government was pushed out of power over all of this. But ultimately, Ottawa stayed the choice and is the capital of Canada today.
Because both sides disliked it? Did they talk about that?
Yeah, everybody disliked Ottawa at that time. It was a shabby little lumber town, and so nobody was particularly happy about it. But it seemed like it's better than to continue to fight about it.
A detail about John A. MacDonald is his friend McGee. And I had not known that MacDonald had an alcohol problem, and so did McGee. Now, was that irregular at the time so much that they would comment on it?
Well, I would say that it's alcohol consumption was much higher in the mid-19th century in both Canada and the United States than it is today. And among leading men, you'd be hard pressed to find many leaders who did not consume a great deal of alcohol. Though I'll put an asterisk on that, there was a growing temperance movement, and Abraham Lincoln, for example, almost never drank. But John A. MacDonald's heavy drinking is all too characteristic of the age, and his boon companion is an Irish-born politician, Thomas D'Arcy McGee. And they are both bon vivants, and they love a good story, and they hang out with each other. And other politicians thought, okay, heavy drinking's the norm, but what you two guys are doing is over the top, because there would be periods of time where neither of them were capable of attending sessions of Parliament because of their hangovers. And so at one point, the cabinet said, at least one of you has got to stop drinking. And so MacDonald said to Thomas D'Arcy McGee, I'm not going to stop, so you better stop. But McGee was not having any of it, so it didn't change the behavior of either of them.
Another recommendation for MacDonald is his negotiation with the Crown over these years. However, there is a dark chapter here. Slavery never was a challenge to Canada, but their treatment of Native Americans as they consolidated the continent, similar to what we met in Minnesota. So I guess there was a uniformity whether they were in the U.S. or Canada. They treated the Native Americans as pests to be exterminated or tolerated. Was MacDonald that way?
Well, I would qualify that a bit. I would say the predominant Canadian policy is to try to kill Native culture through kindness, sort of kindness, which is in most of Canada, there were not the brutal wars that characterized the United States against Native peoples. Now, the one great exception, which I talk about in the book, is in British Columbia, where the miners there did do their best to exterminate local Native people so that the miners could control the rivers and harvest gold from them. Those miners were Americans who had moved in there and were out of the control of any government. So the general Canadian policy has a partial similarity with the United States in that both of these countries were committed to the proposition that Native cultures were inferior and they needed to be ended through obliging Native people to send their children to schools where they would be educated in Protestant values and in the values of white Americans or white Canadians. And so John A. MacDonald is very much on board with that, but he's not a cheerleader for the kind of brutal violence that occurred in British Columbia, which he had no part in.
The book is American Civil Wars. Alan Taylor's the author, A Continental History. The war between the states, ongoing, battles sweeping across the landscape. And the professor is very clear about those battles and the preponderance of victories towards the Union armies as they brought into account their overwhelming numbers and their ability to generate the tools of war, cannon and rifles and horses. And the Confederate leadership in and around Richmond, not able to counter the weight of the logistics of the North. In addition, the battles were fought, generally speaking, in Virginia and Pennsylvania, so that the Union was always an aggressor, especially when Grant became president. We're not going to spend time there. We're going to go to the war is over, 1865. And I remember a scene, Professor, I don't know, it must have been a newspaper, about traveling over Virginia between Washington and Appomattox Courthouse. And the dogs and the buzzards were everywhere from the dead bodies left out. The professor oft times mentioning the horror of the battles. No glory whatsoever, horror. However, at this point, I wanted to make a dart to Mexico again, because there's that Mexican massacres going on at the same time. And the president is Juarez, and he's in flight for 4 years. Do I remember that correctly? Running from the aggressor out of Mexico City.
Well, it's 3 years.
3
but you've got the president of the legitimate government of Mexico, the Republic of Mexico, is Benito Juarez. By this point, Ocampo is dead. He'd been killed by conservative guerrillas. Juarez and a handful of supporters are pushed all the way to the vicinity of El Paso, Texas. That's how small his foothold had become in his own country, replaced by a monarchy supported by French troops of the French Emperor Napoleon III. And that monarch in Mexico is Maximilian. So at that point in time, being 1865, it looks like the imperialists of Maximilian and Napoleon III have defeated Benito Juarez. But Juarez is so committed to his cause as the cause of law and of justice, and he has such formidable dignity and power of will and intellect that he will eventually build up a sufficient force to overcome this invasion and occupation of Mexico.
And the U.S. position at this point, Lincoln is dead between 65 and 67 when Maximilian is dead. Is the U.S. take a position on who they choose to deal with, Mexico City or Juarez?
Well, during the American Civil War, it's the existence of that Civil War that enables Napoleon III to send in military forces to support the conservatives and to install Maximilian as the emperor in Mexico City. Once the American Civil War is over, then all bets will be off. But during the Civil War, the Union government, led by Lincoln, with his Secretary of State, William Seward, recognize the reality that they can't fight France too. They can't send troops into Mexico. They got their hands full fighting the Confederacy. So long as the Confederacy is tying up Union forces, there will be no American intervention against the French intervention. But what happens when the Confederacy is defeated? Lee's army surrenders, the Confederate government collapses, and the Union is restored. Well, then General Grant, the great leader of Union forces, wants to intervene directly in Mexico by sending in U.S. troops. But Seward and Lincoln's successor as president, Andrew Johnson, overrule it. And instead, what the United States will do is to covertly send in munitions to support Juarez's forces. And those munitions will be sufficient for Juarez to build up his forces and to sweep Maximilian out of power.
We need to turn to Andrew Johnson, Professor. Alan Taylor is the author. American Civil Wars is the book. It is after the war. The horror is ended, but it hasn't. And that is the confounding detail of what is generally understood as Reconstruction, which sounds a benign word, but massed murder, routine murder, The word we have in the 21st century conveys it. Lynching. It was commonplace. Throughout the South, the Confederates going home were viciously resentful of what had happened. And some of their generals took charge. We know them now as the Klan or the White Privilege or the White League. They took charge of ex-Confederates, and they believed that they were conveying the authority of the government as they brutalized the freed slaves. And the U.S. government at the time had very little to do to stopping this. The professor provides the statistic that in April of 65, there were 202,000 Union troops in the Confederacy. In 1866, there were 18,000. So we're talking about a dramatic demobilization. But it all turns on Andrew Johnson, former senator from Tennessee, whom Abraham Lincoln chose to be his vice president in the election of 64, as a man who could fuse the two parts of the country together. Once in office, though, with Lincoln dead, well, they knew him, Professor, as an alcoholic copperhead. What did they mean when they called him that?
Well, a copperhead was a term of abuse applied by Unionists toward Democratic politicians and voters who seemed to favor the South during the Civil War. Now, in fact, Andrew Johnson was not a copperhead during the war. He was very much against the Confederacy. But once he became president, his great challenge is, how can he get himself reelected? And he knew that he was a lifelong Democrat from Tennessee, and Lincoln had put him on the ticket in order to appeal to Democrats. So Douglas doesn't feel comfortable with Republicans, and Republican politicians in Congress don't feel comfortable with him. So Johnson's not sure that he's going to get the Republican Party nomination in 1868. So he's starting to angle to rebuild the Democratic Party, and he reaches out to the South, and he starts to become somebody who is the best friend of former Confederates. He pardons them. He helps them get back into power in their states, and he is counting on them then to nominate him for the re-election as president as a Democratic candidate in 1868. And so that helps to explain most of his behavior. The other part of it is that he was a virulent racist. He distrusted, disliked African Americans, did not want to have them have any civil rights, including the vote. And so he is then pitted in conflict against an overwhelming Republican majority in Congress that regards him as having turned about and become pro-Confederate after the war was over.
Of the 15,000 names identified as landowners and slave keepers who were not to be trusted giving back their franchise, Johnson pardoned 13,500, and there were rumors that he took money for it. However, at the same time, he forced the prosecution of the assassins of Abraham Lincoln, driving that story so that it's very difficult today to solve all of the intrigue of the plot against Lincoln and the plot against the U.S. government at the time. Johnson was a man on the defensive and in a hurry. However, I took this note, Professor, because it seemed to me, again, illustrating the contradictions of the time. Connecticut, Minnesota, and Wisconsin passed laws preventing freed men from voting. Did I write that down correctly?
Well, they had laws already on the books. So during the Civil War, on Northern blacks, there were free blacks in the North. They were a relatively small population. But outside of the New England states, they couldn't vote. A few could qualify by a special property qualification in New York. But in the broad stretch of the rest of the country in the North, there were laws against blacks voting. And there were referendums periodically to say, well, let's actually open the vote up to black men. Nobody was talking about opening it up to black women or to white women at that time. And in those referendums, they almost always lost. And so Johnson is able to exploit this apparent hypocrisy by saying to Northern congressmen, you're trying to force me to force on the Southern states. They're opening up the vote to black men, but you won't do it in your own state of Ohio. So what makes that right? So Johnson had a certain immoral consistency in promoting keeping blacks everywhere away from the vote, whereas most Northern Republicans were inconsistent at that time. But that recognition of that inconsistency actually led to most Northern states coming around to support the vote for blacks in their states, as well as the South, as we get to the end of the 1860s.
And there was, I mean, we go through the impeachment, the final vote in May, not removing him from office, racing off to, I believe, Cincinnati for the convention. Grant would be nominated to be president of the United States in the 68 election. At the time, and I'm not sure I read this consistently, there was still the argument, was that war for the Union or was that war for freeing the slaves? Was that argument still going on in 68?
Yeah, I mean, it's still going on in the sense that in late 1862, Lincoln and most Republicans had come around to the conviction that to save the Union, they needed to end slavery. Their priority was always to save the Union, but they reached the conviction that a military victory required smashing the economy of the South and recruiting black troops. Once you reach that conclusion, then you have to add as a secondary goal of the war effort to emancipate the slaves within the Confederacy. And then in 1865, early 1865, they get a constitutional constitutional amendment, which would ban slavery everywhere in the United States. But once the Reconstruction becomes violently contested in the South, it is testing the will of Northern politicians. Are they willing to continue this military occupation and supervision of the Southern states in order to protect the new civil rights of blacks? Or were they going to decide that they would reconcile with the South on terms that kept slavery at an end, but which allowed the segregation and the disenfranchisement of new black citizens in the South? That becomes the choice by the middle of the 1870s. And Northern politicians overwhelmingly decided for the latter, which is to say the war had been about the Union. We've restored the Union. The Confederates accept that they are part of the Union permanently. They accept that slavery is at an end. And so we're going to leave the whole question of black people and their rights to Southern states to solve if they want to.
And here come the Blackcoats. What were those, Professor?
Well, the first Blackcoats were actually introduced in 1865. Andrew Johnson allowed this to happen. The newly reconstructed Southern governments imposed these very strict restrictions on the rights of blacks and basically compelled them to remain agricultural laborers. They couldn't be bought and sold anymore. They weren't supposed to be whipped anymore. So they weren't technically slaves, but they were held in a kind of serfdom under these Blackcoats. Well, the Republican Congress said we're appalled by this, and so they start to move against Johnson, and they are able to end these neo-Confederate governments that were established immediately after the Civil War, and to impose a military-guided reconstruction of the South until the middle of the 1870s, when they back off from that, allow Southern whites to restore their domination, and after that, they bring back versions of the Blackcoats.
And the Blackcoats remain for the balance of the century. They come to be known as Jim Crow, but that beyond the scope of the professor's conversation this time. We're going to turn to other aspects of ironic inconsistencies, the Native Americans, the Chinese, and the Canadians. This is Alan Taylor's American Civil Wars, A Continental History, 1850 to 1873. The West was not outside of the war fighting during 1861 to 1865. But following the war, the West became a battle zone over many decades. We begin with the Bozeman Trail, where the Native Americans, gathering around a chief named Red Cloud, drove out the encroachment, the forts of the U.S. Army. However, that would be the beginning of the tale, not the end of it. Again, Professor, I'm come to the irony that a nation that tore itself in pieces over slavery did not see the way it was treating Native Americans to be worse than slaves. In fact, there was Indian slavery, and they tried to stop it and couldn't in the new territories. Was that a debate? Were there McManuses or Swisshelms about brutalizing Native Americans in any of the editorial pages?
Well, there are two positions that are held in the United States toward Native peoples, and neither of them would be what we would consider a modern humane approach. Leaving Native peoples alone with their own cultures was not considered acceptable by almost anyone in political authority. So the choice is you exterminate them. That's one option, and that was pretty popular, particularly with many settlers in the West. The second position, which is the dominant one, held by and dominant in the federal government, is the greatest kindness you could do to Native peoples would be to restrict them on reservations, disarm them, and force them to give up their culture, force them to become American citizens, and incorporate them into the United States so that Native peoples would continue to exist, but not as Native peoples, but just as other Americans, just as Irish Americans had moved here, or German Americans, that it just would be one big country with certain ethnicities, but equal rights for all, and they would be individuals. Well, this is not acceptable to most Native peoples. They don't want to just be individual American citizens. They want to preserve their culture. They want to preserve their language. They want to preserve their own governance. And that was just considered unacceptable by Americans. And so they used military power to force Native peoples onto reservations and to force them to submit their children to these re-education programs, often at pretty grim boarding schools.
It is difficult also to read about Grant and Sheridan. Sheridan, the great cavalry officer who rode in the valley, the Shenandoah Valley, reversing defeats in 1964, became part of Lincoln's reelection campaign. But Grant used him, Grant in the White House, as chief of the army and also enforcer out west against the Native American population. And Sheridan was brutal towards them. So he held two things in his mind. He had been a principal freeing the slaves, but he was the heavy hand of authority when it came to brutalizing the Native Americans. And I guess that's the position they all held. They didn't see that inconsistency.
No, they didn't see an inconsistency because they are committed to the liberalism of the 19th century. And the liberalism of the 19th century said the best society is one that's composed of equal individuals. And there aren't these corporate groups like Native American tribes that have some sort of distinctive state in society. So the drive is to just eliminate things like seceding Southern states or Native American tribes, and just to create this uniform landscape of uniform equal rights. And, in a way, it sounds nice, but if what you're doing is you're forcing people to give up a culture, a language, a way of life that's been very dear to them, and you're doing so by military force, you're suppressing their religious practices, you're suppressing the expression of their own language, that is, frankly, a great cruelty. But they didn't recognize that because they thought being an American citizen was the best thing in the world. So why wouldn't everybody want it? And if you resisted it and you were a weaker people, you should be subjected to military force in order to compel you to be American citizens. That was the thinking of the time. And so that's how Sheridan thought. That's how Grant thought. They had come to shed their most of their racism toward Black Americans, but Black Americans wanted that vision of being equal individual citizens in the United States. Native peoples didn't.
Between 1840 and 1880, I think I have my note correct, 300,000 Chinese workers came to America to work on the railroad and other projects out west. They were denied citizenship. What was the thinking?
Well, the Chinese are a great challenge to American racial thinking because American racial thinking tended to treat minorities as lazy. And it's a great distortion because there were fewer people that had to work hard as African Americans at that time just to survive. But that was the thinking. Well, you got with the Chinese who were technically free, they're not held in slavery, though some of them arrived as indentured servants. And they're extremely communal and cooperating with each other and working extremely hard and saving their money. And they are in many communities in the West, such as San Francisco, conspicuous by their success at being entrepreneurs in small businesses. And this is something that infuriates a significant number of Western white men who feel that there's something unfair about the ways in which the Chinese would cooperate with each other to get ahead economically and to defy the racial thinking of the time, which said that white Americans were superior. And so white Americans in the West start to elect governments, legislators and congressmen and governors who would be committed to denying citizenship to the Chinese, and by the end of the 19th century to restrict any further immigration from China into the United States.
To begin at the ending, we go back to Jane McManus, who's known as the anti-abolitionist in her youth, who after she loses her husband, after that, she founds Black education schools in the West Indies and becomes what she wrote against in her younger life. Was that commonplace, Professor?
Well, I wouldn't say that most people make as radical a change as she did, but it's not unknown. I also the example of Joseph Shelby, who had been a very active in the burning of the anti-slavery town of Lawrence, Kansas in the 1850s and had become a very successful Confederate general. After the Civil War, he comes to accept Black equality, and he even pushes for the erection of a statue to honor John Brown, who had been his great enemy during the 1850s and called John Brown the greatest man of the age. So it is possible for people to rethink core convictions. And Jane McManus Casno rethought her racist convictions, and by the end of her life is committed to doing everything she could to help people of African descent in the Caribbean and the United States to achieve better educations.
The book is American Civil Wars, So Many Stories. Wonderful. Alan Taylor is the author, A Continental History, 1850 to 1873. I'm John Batchelor.